The heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots finally faded, replaced by the distant, haunting wail of a siren somewhere out on the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. Mandy didn't move. Her hand remained clamped over the stranger's mouth, her palm dampened by his sweat and the heat of his ragged breath. She could feel the vibration of his throat as he swallowed, a primal sound that seemed to echo in the hollow space of the vintage wine barrel. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drip of condensation against wood. Then, Mandy slowly retracted her hand. Her fingers were trembling. She stood back, her black maid uniform rustling in the dark, and watched as the man shifted. Lim Gisuk emerged from the barrel like a predator rising from a shallow grave. Even wounded, his presence was suffocating. His shoulder-length hair fell over his face in messy, dark arcs, and as he gripped the edge of the wood to pull himself out, the white cuffs of his expensive shirt, now stained a deep, visceral crimson, retracted to reveal the ink of dragons winding up his forearms. He hit the stone floor with a muffled thud, his knees buckling for a fraction of a second before his sheer will forced him upright. He leaned against a rack of vintage Bordeaux, his breath coming in sharp, shallow hisses. The metallic scent of copper was overwhelming now, mixing with the earthy aroma of the cellar. He looked at Mandy, his gaze piercing through the dim light. It wasn't the look of a victim, it was the look of a king who had just watched his palace burn. "Why?" His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down Mandy's spine. He didn't ask who she was or where he was. He wanted to know the motive behind the mercy. Mandy straightened her white apron, her internal clock still screaming at her to run, to scream, to call the police. "Because they had guns, and you were bleeding," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And because in this neighborhood, the men in those boots never come to do anything good." Gisuk's eyes narrowed, tracking the movement of her hands. He reached into his suit jacket, his fingers searching for a weapon he'd clearly lost in the fray. Finding nothing, he let out a bitter, dry laugh that turned into a wince of pain as he clutched his side. He looked at the door, then back at the waitress. He was the dragon of Seoul, a man who commanded thousands, yet in this moment he realized the terrifying math of his situation. His second-in-command knew the coordinates of the meeting. His bodyguards had been neutralized before they could even draw. Every brother he had sworn to protect was likely currently celebrating his death. He looked at Mandy, really looked at her. She was a ghost in the machine of high society, a woman paid to be invisible, wearing the uniform of the help. And yet, she was the only person in a city of 10 million who wasn't actively trying to put a bullet in his head.
"They'll come back to finish the job," Gisuk said, his voice hardening into a cold, lethal edge. He took a staggering step toward her, his shadow looming large against the cellar walls. "And if they find you here, they'll kill you just for looking at me." Mandy looked at the blood on the floor, then at the tattoos on his neck. The gravity of what she'd done finally settled in. She hadn't just saved a man. She had interfered with a war. "Then I guess we both need to leave," she said. Gisuk reached out, his hand, strong and calloused, grabbing her forearm. It wasn't a gesture of affection, but one of claim. "I don't have a home to go to, waitress. Not tonight. Tonight I only have enemies, and apparently I have you." The smell of gasoline hit Mandy before the heat did. It was a sharp chemical intrusion that sliced through the damp scent of the cellar. Above them, the floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned under the weight of a sudden violent orange glow that began to bleed through the cracks in the ceiling. Gisuk's grip on Mandy's arm tightened, his knuckles white against her skin. "They're burning it," Mandy whispered, her voice hitching. Her mind raced to her locker, her tips, her spare shoes, the small framed photo of her mother. Everything she owned was being swallowed by a vengeful fire meant to erase any trace of the dragon's survival. Gisuk didn't waste time on sentiment. He moved with a sudden, jagged energy, dragging her toward the rear of the cellar, where a small rusted delivery lift sat hidden behind crates of empty bottles. If we stay, we're the charcoal. If we go out the front, we're target practice. Move! The lift groaned as they ascended, the air growing thick and oily with smoke. When the doors shuttered open into the back alley, the heat was a physical blow. The lounge was roaring, the sound like 1,000 dry bones snapping at once. Mandy stumbled into the cold night air, coughing, her lungs burning. She turned to run toward the street, toward the safety of the sirens she could still hear in the distance. But Jisok's hand caught the back of her uniform collar, yanking her back into the shadows. "Not that way," he hissed. A black SUV with darkened windows cruised slowly past the alley entrance, its headlights searching the smoke like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. "You think the police are coming for you? Those sirens are blocks away, diverted by a gas leak call. The men in that car are here to count the bodies. If they see a waitress walking away from a bonfire, they'll make sure you aren't so lucky. Then they'll make sure you aren't." Mandy looked at the burning building, her livelihood, and then at the car. The reality of her association settled into her bones like ice. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was evidence. "I have a car," she panted, pointing toward the staff lot. "A beat-up Honda. I can just—"
"You can die," Jisok interrupted, his voice cold and final. He was leaning heavily against a brick wall, his face pale, but his eyes remained sharp, predatory. "They have your plates by now. They have your employee file. By tomorrow morning, Mandy Jones will be a name on a hit list, and you'll be dead in your apartment before you can even lock the deadbolt." Before she could protest, he whistled, a sharp, low sound. Out of the darkness of the far end of the alley, a nondescript gray sedan rolled forward, its lights off. It wasn't one of the flashy cars of the Dragon's Empire. It was a ghost car, meant for disappearances. "Get in," he commanded. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Mandy retreated, her back hitting the cold brick. "I saved your life. Isn't that enough?" Jisok stepped into her space, the scent of smoke and expensive cologne clinging to him. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, almost tragic. "You saved a monster, Mandy, and monsters are selfish. You're coming with me because I'm the only one who knows how to keep a ghost hidden." He didn't wait for her consent. He grabbed her waist and shoved her into the back seat of the sedan, locking with a heavy electronic click. And Mandy realized she wasn't just escaping a fire. She was being pulled into the heart of a storm. The sedan moved like a ghost through the labyrinthine back streets of the city, eventually pulling into a nondescript industrial garage that smelled of grease and old concrete. Jisok didn't speak as the driver, a silent man with a face like granite, helped him out of the car. They ascended in a freight elevator to a loft that looked like a fortress disguised as a residence. Steel shutters blocked the windows, and the air inside was filtered and cold. This was the Shadow King's sanctum, a place that didn't appear on any deed or map. "Sit," Mandy commanded, her voice regaining its practical edge as the adrenaline began to level out. She didn't wait for his permission. She had spent years working double shifts on her feet. She knew how to manage a crisis when there was no one else to do it. Jisok collapsed onto a leather sofa, his breath hitching as he peeled away his ruined suit jacket. The white shirt beneath was a map of violence. Mandy returned from the kitchen with a basin of warm water, antiseptic, and a clean roll of bandages. As she began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric, the full extent of the man was revealed. The tattoos weren't just decorative, they were a narrative. Dragons coiled around his ribs, their scales interlocking with scars from old blades and older betrayals. But as she pressed a warm cloth to the jagged graze on his side, she felt him flinch, a sharp human tremor that broke through his stony facade.
"I thought monsters didn't feel pain," she murmured, her eyes focused on the wound. Jisok leaned his head back against the sofa, his throat exposed, the ink of a phoenix rising toward his jawline. "Monsters just learn to hide it better than people," he rasped. His eyes were closed, the long lashes casting shadows against his pale skin.
In the harsh LED light of the loft, the Dragon of Soul looked less like a myth and more like a man who was profoundly tired of fighting. Mandy worked in silence, her movements sure and gentle. She cleaned the grit from the bullet graze, noting how his muscles bunched and relaxed under her touch. There was a strange, heavy intimacy in the room. She was a woman who had spent her life serving drinks to men who didn't know her name, and now she was tending to the deepest wounds of a man who could change the city's weather with a phone call. As she applied the antiseptic, Jisok's hand shot out, catching her wrist. For a moment, she expected him to push her away, but his grip was loose, almost searching. He opened his eyes, and for the first time the predatory sharpness was gone, replaced by a raw, haunting vulnerability. "You have steady hands, Mandy Jones," he whispered, his gaze locked onto hers. "Most people tremble when they realize who I am, or they wait for me to die so they can see what falls out of my pockets." "I told you," Mandy said, pulling her wrist back gently to finish the bandage. "I'm a waitress. I've dealt with plenty of bleeding hearts and broken glass. You're just a bigger version of the same mess." Jisok watched her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It wasn't the smile of a boss. It was the look of a man seeing something he hadn't realized existed in his world. Genuine, unbought care. He closed his eyes again as she wrapped the gauze around his torso, the silence of the sanctum wrapping around them both like a shroud. For the first time in years, the dragon wasn't hunting. He was simply breathing. The morning sun attempted to pierce the steel shutters of the loft, casting thin, skeletal ribs of light across the cold floor. Jisok sat at a polished obsidian table, staring at a wall of monitors that displayed static and empty street corners. He looked sharper today, the fever of the wound replaced by a chilling, focused stillness. Mandy stood by the kitchenette, her hands wrapped around a mug of bitter coffee, still wearing the wrinkled remains of her maid uniform, a stark reminder of the life that had gone up in flames. "My men are dead or hiding," Jisok said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The security footage from the lounge was wiped remotely before the fire was even set. My second-in-command, Ji-hoon, is already moving to consolidate the board. He'll tell them I died in the fire. Without proof of who pulled the trigger, I'm just a ghost haunting a lost empire.
Mandy set her mug down with a soft click. She walked over to the table, her eyes tracking the movement of the static on the screens. "It wasn't just a random hit, Jisok. I told you that in the cellar." He looked up at her, his dark eyes narrowed. "You said they were waiting. That's a guess, Mandy. In my world, guesses get people buried." "It wasn't a guess," she countered, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. She leaned over the table, her face inches from his. "I've worked that lounge for 3 years. I know the rhythm of the room. I know who drinks top shelf and who's just there to be seen. 2 hours before you arrived, 3 men took the corner booth, the one with the blind spot near the service entrance. They didn't order food. They ordered 1 round of water and sat there like statues." Jisok went perfectly still. The waitress eyes he had dismissed were now dissecting the scene with the precision of a forensic analyst. "Describe them," he commanded. Mandy closed her eyes, the memory of the night playing back in high definition. The leader had a scar running through his left eyebrow, jagged like a lightning bolt. He kept checking a silver pocket watch, not a phone, a watch. The other 2 were younger. One had a tattoo of a weeping willow on his throat. I remember because he looked at me when I brought the water. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my neck, like he was deciding where to cut. Jisuk's breath caught.
He knew those descriptions. The man with the silver watch was a mercenary he'd personally exiled 2 years ago. The willow tattoo belonged to a recruit from Ji-hoon's own private security detail. "You saw them," Ji-suk whispered, the weight of the revelation shifting the air in the room. "You didn't just see them, you looked at them." "I see everyone," Mandy said simply. "That's the job. You're invisible until someone needs a refill." Ji-suk stood up, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. He reached out, not to grab her this time, but to lift her chin so she had to meet his gaze. For the first time, he didn't look at her as a liability or a stray he'd picked up. He looked at her as the most lethal weapon in his arsenal. "Ji-hoon thinks he's erased every witness," Ji-suk rasped, a dark, predatory spark returning to his eyes. "He thinks the fire took everything, but he forgot about the woman in the white apron. You're the only person who can put those men at the scene. You're the only one who can prove the betrayal started from within." Mandy felt a cold shiver of dread. "What does that mean for me?"
"It means you're no longer just a waitress, Mandy Jones," Ji-suk said, his grip firming. "You're the only reason I'm going to be able to burn his world down, and it means I can never let you out of my sight." Ji-suk didn't just want Mandy to remember the traitors, he wanted her to hunt them. But a woman in a stained waitress uniform was a target, and a ghost was easily ignored. To get her into the lion's den, he had to change her silhouette entirely. The transformation took place in the cold, clinical silence of the loft. Ji-suk summoned a silent team of tailors and stylists, people who asked no questions and lived on his payroll. For hours, Mandy was poked, prodded, and painted. They stripped away the remnants of the underground lounge, replacing the scent of stale wine and smoke with the expensive floral notes of Bulgarian rose and sandalwood. "You are no longer Mandy Jones," Ji-suk said, his voice a low vibration behind her, as he watched her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. Mandy stared back at a stranger. Her hair, usually pinned back in a functional tight bun, had been sculpted into an architectural masterpiece of sleek waves. Her makeup was minimal but lethal, highlighting the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She wore a gown of midnight silk that clung to her like a second skin, the deep indigo hue making her skin glow under the LED lights. It was a dress designed for a woman who owned the room, not a woman who cleaned it. Ji-suk stepped closer, his own black suit tailored to hide the bandages beneath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds that caught the light like shards of ice. As he leaned in to fasten the clasp, his fingers brushed the nape of her neck. The touch was brief, but the heat of it lingered, a sharp contrast to the cold stones resting against her collarbone. "You are my guest from the London branch, a consultant with a sharp eye for detail. You will stand by my side, you will drink the champagne, and you will look at every man in that room the way you looked at the men in the cellar." Mandy looked at their joined reflection. They looked like a power couple carved from shadow. "They'll know, Ji-suk. They'll see the waitress underneath." "No," he countered, his hand resting firmly on her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "They won't, because in their world, people like you don't exist unless you're holding a tray. Their arrogance is your greatest armor. They will look at your dress, they will look at your jewels, and they will look at me. They will never suspect that the woman on my arm is the one who's going to hang them." He led her toward the elevator, his limp barely noticeable now, masked by a terrifying, renewed grace. Mandy felt the weight of the diamonds and the weight of the lie. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. Ji-suk had turned her into a siren, a beautiful distraction designed to lead his enemies onto the rocks. As the elevator doors closed, Ji-suk handed her a small, concealed earpiece.
If you see the man with the silver watch or the willow tattoo, you don't react. You just touch your necklace. I'll do the rest." Mandy nodded, her heart hammering against the silk of her gown. The dragon was back, and he was using her as his most elegant bait. The game had moved from the cellar to the ballroom, and the stakes were no longer just survival, they were total annihilation. The private dining room of the Sheila Hotel was a vacuum of opulence, silent save for the clinking of silver against fine bone china. Ji-sok sat at the head of the long obsidian table, a king resurrected, surrounded by the brothers who had likely toasted to his ghost 48 hours ago. Mandy sat at his right hand, the midnight silk of her gown shimmering like oil on water. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive tobacco, but underneath it lay the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed fear. Across the table, Ji-hoon, the second in command, was a study in controlled composure. He wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his hands moving with a calculated elegance as he poured wine for the elders. "To Ji-sok," Ji-hoon said, standing and raising his glass. His voice was smooth, a silk ribbon hiding a garrote. "To Ji-sok, a man who survives a fire that should have claimed the city, to the dragon's return." The elders murmured their assent, lifting their glasses. Mandy felt Ji-sok's hand rest on her thigh beneath the table, a warning, a grounding force. She didn't look at the wine. She didn't look at the smiles. She watched the room the way she had watched the lounge, cataloging the bad math of human behavior. Her gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where the personal security detail stood like shadows against the mahogany walls. There, standing behind Ji-hoon's chair, was a young man with a high collar that didn't quite hide the edge of a weeping willow tattoo reaching to his jaw. The air in Mandy's lungs turned to ice. It was him. She didn't reach for her necklace yet. She waited, her eyes drifting back to the table. Ji-hoon was reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a silver pocket watch, checking the time with a flick of his thumb before snapping it shut. The click was tiny, but to Mandy, it sounded like a gunshot.
Then she saw it, the subtle sign she had witnessed in the lounge 2 hours before the cellar turned into a tomb. Ji-hoon didn't drink from his own glass. As the toast concluded, he reached out and adjusted the placement of Ji-sok's wine, rotating the crystal stem a quarter turn to the right. It was a waiter's habit, a perfectionist's twitch, but Mandy remembered the man with the lightning bolt scar doing the exact same thing with the water glasses in the corner booth. It was a signal, a marker. The wine in Ji-sok's glass wasn't just wine. Ji-sok began to lift the crystal to his lips, his expression unreadable. The traitors were watching, their pulses visible in the hollows of their throats. Mandy didn't hesitate. She didn't touch her necklace. Instead, she let out a soft, staged laugh, leaning toward Ji-sok with the practiced grace of a smitten consort. As she moved, her silk sleeve accidentally swept across the table, catching the rim of Ji-sok's glass. The crystal toppled. Dark red liquid blossomed on the white linen like a fresh chest wound, soaking into the fabric and splashing onto Ji-hoon's hand. The room went deathly silent. Ji-hoon's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a murderous, panicked light. "Oh, how glimsy of me," Mandy whispered, her voice a low, melodic purr that carried through the tension. She looked at Ji-hoon, her eyes cold and knowing. She reached up and slowly, deliberately touched the raw diamonds at her throat. Ji-sok's grip on her thigh tightened. He didn't look at the spilled wine. He looked at Ji-hoon, and for the first time that evening, the dragon smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just seen his prey step into the light. The aftermath of the spilled wine was a blur of controlled chaos. Gisak had used the distraction to retreat, pulling Mandy into the gilded hallways of the hotel, but the air already felt like a closing trap. They didn't make it to the elevator. The man with the weeping willow tattoo appeared from a service alcove, no longer a silent shadow, but a jagged blade of reality. He wasn't alone. In the windowless security corridor, the polished veneer of the gala stripped away, revealing the jagged teeth of the coup. "The waitress," Ji-hun's voice echoed behind them, stripped of its silk. He stepped into the hall, dabbing a spot of red wine from his cuff with a white handkerchief. "I knew there was a reason I couldn't place your face, consort. You don't belong in silk. You belong in a cellar smelling of dust and cheap floor wax."
He held up a tablet. On the screen was a grainy, high-definition freeze frame from the lounge's hidden backup server. Mandy, in her white apron and bun, her hand pressed firmly over Gisok's mouth inside the barrel. "A barrel, Gisok? Really?" Ji-hun laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "The great dragon, hiding like a rat in the vinegar, and saved by a girl who clears away empty bottles." Before Gisok could draw his weapon, the willow-tattooed guard pressed a silenced barrel into the soft space behind Mandy's ear. Gisok froze, his fingers twitching near his holster. The predatory fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by something Mandy had never seen in him: hesitation. "Let her go, Ji-hun," Gisok rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal low frequency. "She's a civilian. She has nothing to do with the board." "She is the only reason you're standing here," Ji-hun countered, stepping closer. "And she is the only reason I'm going to get what I want. The elders are waiting for your signature on the transfer of the port territories. They think you're retiring for health reasons after the fire. Sign the digital deeds, and maybe I'll let her live long enough to see the sunrise." The silence in the corridor was suffocating. Mandy looked at Gisok. She saw the calculation behind his eyes, the math of an empire he had spent 15 years with blood and bone. If he signed, he lost everything. He would be a man with no name, no power, and a target on his back that would never fade. He would be giving his kingdom to the man who tried to burn him alive. "Gisok, don't!" Mandy whispered, the cold metal of the gun biting into her skin. Gisok looked at her, not at the silk dress or the diamonds he had draped around her, but at the woman who had held his life in her hands when he was nothing but a dying man in a barrel. The empire was heavy, but her life was a weight he realized he couldn't drop. "The tablet," Gisok said, his voice sounding older, heavier. He reached out his hand, his bays never leaving Mandy's. "Bring it here. I'll sign." "Gisok, no!" Mandy cried out, but the guard shoved her hard against the wall, the breath leaving her lungs. Ji-hun smirked, savoring the moment of absolute triumph. "I always knew you were soft, Gisok. You just needed the right bait to prove it." As Gisok reached for the tablet to sign away his life's work, he caught Mandy's eye for a split second. In that look, the vulnerability she had seen in the safe house was gone. The dragon wasn't surrendering. He was waiting for the barrel to break.
"You tried to burn me," Gisok whispered, his face inches from the traitor's. "But you forgot. I was born in the fire. And the waitress? She's the one who taught me how to count the ashes." He didn't kill him. Not yet. He dropped Ji-hun's gasping body to the floor just as the heavy doors at the end of the hall burst open. It wasn't the police. It was the elders' private enforcers, their faces grim as they looked at the evidence of Ji-hun's embezzlement scrolling on every screen in the building. Gisok turned his back on the wreckage of his old life and reached his hand down to Mandy. His palm was bloody, his suit was ruined, but as he pulled her to her feet, his touch was as gentle as it had been in the cellar. The math was finally settled. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. The Sheila Hotel's security corridor, once a site of pristine luxury, was now a monument to a fallen coup. As the elders' enforcers dragged Ji-hun and his conspirators into the shadows of the night to face the grim justice of the underworld, the air seemed to clear for the first time in days. The metallic tang of adrenaline and smoke began to dissipate, replaced by the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. Ji-seok stood in the center of the hall, his silhouette framed by the flickering lights. He looked down at his hands, hands that had built an empire, hands that had killed to protect it, and hands that had just signed away his old life to save a stranger. He turned to Mandy, who was standing a few feet away, her midnight silk gown torn at the shoulder, the raw diamonds at her throat reflecting the cold light of a new reality. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. The predatory mask he wore for the world had finally cracked, leaving behind the man she had tended to in the sanctum. He stopped just inches from her, his presence no longer suffocating, but shielding. "The lounge is gone," Ji-seok said, his voice a low, rough velvet. "The life you had, the shifts, the tips, the invisibility, it's all ashes. Ji-hun made sure of that the moment he lit the match." Mandy looked at the wreckage round them, then up at him. "I know. I've been a ghost since the moment I pushed you into that barrel." Ji-seok reached out, his thumb grazing her cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot with a tenderness that contradicted the ink on his skin. "I told you that monsters are selfish. I meant it. I've purged the traitors, and I've taken back the chair, but the empire I'm building now isn't the one I had yesterday. Yesterday, I was surrounded by brothers who were waiting for me to bleed. Today, I realize that the only person who saw me at my weakest and didn't try to break me was a woman with a tray and a sharp eye for bad math." He took a step back, opening his hand to her. It wasn't an order this time. It was an invitation. "I don't need a waitress to bring me drinks, and I don't need a maid to clean up my messes," he whispered, his eyes locking on to hers with a raw, terrifying honesty. "I need the woman who knows how to spot a lie before it's spoken. I need the only person in this city I trust with my life. Stay. Not as my help, and not as my bait. Stay as my partner. The dragon needs a conscience, Mandy, and I think mine has been hiding in a wine cellar all along." Mandy looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of the fire, the cold word of the barrel, and the way he had looked at her when he chose her life over his kingdom. The world of the Korean Mafia was dangerous, dark, and filled with shadows, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. She reached out and placed her hand in his, her fingers interlacing with his tattooed grip. "I'm still keeping an eye on the ledgers, Ji-seok," she murmured, a small, resilient smile touching her lips. "I hate bad math." Ji-seok pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers as the sun began to rise over Seoul. The old empire was dead. A new one was rising, built not just on blood and bone, but on the silent, unbreakable bond between a king and the woman who had saved him from the dark.